I thought I was hired to care for a fragile old man. But what he revealed to me in the dead of night made me realize I had been walking into a web of lies, deceit, and a darkness no one ever speaks of. When I first arrived at his house, I had no idea what I was walking into. The first thing that struck me about Mr. Aldridge's house was the silence. Not the quiet you expect when a place is empty, but a heavy, deliberate hush, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The driveway was lined with hedges that had grown wild over the years, prickly branches scratching at the edges of the path. I parked my car at the end and stared at the house, an imposing structure of gray stone and shuttered windows that seemed to peer back at me. There was something in its presence, something that whispered of old wealth, old grudges, and secrets better left undisturbed. He opened the door before I could knock, standing there like a sentinel who had been waiting for me all along. Mr. Aldridge was taller than I expected, lean but upright, with a face carved sharply by time and an expression that was both patient and calculating. His eyes, pale and unflinching, slid over me in a way that made me feel both observed and tested. "You must be Eleanor," he said, his voice low, calm, and unsettlingly precise. A single nod, a silent invitation, and I stepped inside. The house smelled of dust, antiseptic, and something metallic, faint, elusive, and almost unpleasantly sharp. The air was thick with age and neglect, yet carefully maintained in certain corners, as though someone had deliberately preserved some parts while letting others crumble. The floors were polished wood, scuffed in places, creaking under my steps in a way that sounded amplified in the heavy silence. I had learned early in my career that quiet houses often hid stories louder than words. It didn't take long to notice the oddities. Photographs, for instance, family portraits, landscapes, snapshots of events long past, were tucked behind lamps, half hidden on shelves, or leaned against walls at impossible angles. Some frames were empty, their glass scratched and dusty. I could hear faint noises from rooms he claimed were empty, a chair scraping against the floor, a soft thump like a footstep. When I asked about it, he simply said, "The house makes its own sounds." His eyes, however, betrayed amusement, or maybe it was something darker, a warning. I began my work carefully, performing my duties with the precision I had honed over years. Checking vitals, preparing meals, assisting him with mobility, tidying the small messes a body confined to a chair inevitably creates. Outwardly, it was routine. Inside, my mind hummed with questions. My sixth sense, that intuitive awareness that had guided me through countless patients' hidden fears and hidden truths, flickered to life. I noted the way he avoided certain topics, the subtle twitch of his hand when I approached his desk, the faint but constant shiver that passed across his shoulders whenever I opened a drawer he had marked as private. The first night brought a creeping sense of the uncanny. I had settled him for bed, adjusting his blanket with the habitual care of years, when I noticed that a chair in the corner of the room had shifted slightly, as if someone, or something, had been sitting there. I dismissed it. Probably the uneven floor. But then came the whispers. Soft at first, indecipherable murmurs from upstairs, from a wing he had insisted was abandoned. My heart thumped against my ribs, and yet, curiosity compelled me to listen. I could not ignore it. By the second day, the tension began to weave itself into the ordinary rhythms of caregiving. Mr. Aldridge's movements were methodical, almost ritualistic. He straightened the cushions on his chair every morning, then again at night, as though they were markers for some invisible boundary. The placement of books, the alignment of utensils, even the way he poured his tea, all seemed carefully choreographed. I felt like an intruder into a theater of subtle control, a performance whose script I had yet to read. Late that afternoon, I discovered something peculiar, a small stack of letters shoved behind a cabinet, yellowed with age. Some were addressed to people I had never heard of, some appeared never to have been sent at all. There were photographs inside them, faces blurred or crossed out with ink. Something in me instinctively knew these were not ordinary letters, they were fragments of a life deliberately hidden, pieces of a story that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. That night, the house felt alive in a way that was more than imagination. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and the faint whispering continued, punctuated by soft knocks or creaks that I could not place. And then it happened. I had been adjusting his blanket, my fingers brushing lightly against the coarse fabric, when I heard it, a voice, so low it could have been my imagination, yet unmistakably real. Eleanor. I froze, every muscle in my body alert. His eyes were open, pale, and penetrating, fixed on me in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. Do you know what I've done? The words were deliberate, confessional, and carried the weight of decades. A chill ran through me, sharp and insistent. This was no idle question. It was a probe, a key to something I could sense but not yet touch. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to remain calm. I had dealt with patients who harbored anger, grief, and secrets before, but something about the way he said it made my skin prickle with awareness that this was different, dangerous even. I realized, in that instant, that I was no longer just a caretaker performing routine duties. I had become a part of his story, an unwilling witness to a truth that had lain hidden for decades, waiting for someone like me to arrive. The house seemed to breathe around me, shadows stretching longer, whispers growing faintly urgent, as though the walls themselves were complicit in holding the secret. I lay awake that night, listening to the house. Every creak, every sigh of settling wood, every distant whisper seemed to carry meaning. I wondered how many years had passed in this silence, how many stories had gone untold, and how many secrets Mr. Aldridge had carried alone. I realized then that being a caretaker was more than tending to the body, it was being entrusted with the soul's unspoken confessions, whether you were ready or not. And somewhere deep in that house, I sensed a truth, immense and heavy, that had been buried for decades. It was waiting for me. And I knew, even as sleep eluded me, that my arrival had set something in motion that could not be undone. I thought I was just caring for him, but I was being drawn into a life I wasn't meant to see. By the second week, patterns began to emerge in Mr. Aldridge's behavior. At first, I thought them trivial, small, repetitive gestures that anyone might have, but slowly, they revealed themselves as deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. He rearranged the books on his shelves multiple times a day, aligning their spines with a meticulousness that suggested more than mere preference. The pens on his desk were never in the same place twice, the cushions on his armchair were plumped and angled in exact degrees. These were not habits, they were signals, markers for an unseen order, a code I could not yet decipher. I started keeping mental notes. His reactions were subtle but telling. When I moved toward his locked drawer, the one he had instructed me never to touch, his eyes would flick toward me, sharp, calculating, like a predator testing a prey's boundaries. A slight tightening of his jaw, a barely perceptible lift of an eyebrow, these micro-gestures were warnings, reminders that the house had rules I had not yet learned. But I also noticed something else, a quiet loneliness in him, a craving for acknowledgement, however veiled. He wanted to be watched, in a sense, though not noticed too closely. That intuition of mine, the one I had honed over decades of caregiving, told me he was guarding something important. I had seen this before, patients with secrets so heavy they became a living weight, shaping their every action, their every word. I remembered a woman I had cared for years ago, who insisted on keeping all her letters in a locked box. It wasn't just privacy, it was the preservation of a truth too fragile, too dangerous, to be exposed. I understood that Mr. Aldridge was no different. Late one evening, I found myself alone in the study while he was resting in his chair. Dust motes floated in the dim light from a single lamp. My eyes wandered to the pile of letters I had discovered behind the cabinet days earlier. Something compelled me to sift through them, gently, reverently. Many were innocuous, bills, notes from acquaintances long gone. But then I came across a photograph tucked inside one envelope, black and white, edges frayed. A man I didn't recognize held a child, her face scratched out. A woman stood nearby, her expression stern. My pulse quickened. Even in the faint lamplight, I could sense the tension in the photo, the unspoken story behind it. I pocketed the image, unsure why, but with the instinctive understanding that it was significant. Every day thereafter, I noticed the small ways in which Mr. Aldridge avoided certain topics. Family, friends, old acquaintances, he would deflect or change the subject. Sometimes his gaze would drift to the wall, and I could almost see him there, reliving something, replaying it over and over. Guilt, regret, secrecy, these emotions clung to him like shadows, and I felt them brushing against me, even without words. Then came the phone call that unsettled me more than anything else so far. I had been refilling his water and tidying the kitchen when I heard the low murmur of his voice through the thin wall. He was speaking to someone invisible to me, but the words pierced the quiet night like a knife. "Nothing from that day must ever be uncovered," he said, and there was an unmistakable edge of fear in his tone. "It's buried, and it stays that way. You understand?" I froze. His words were deliberate, precise, and chilling. My mind raced. What had he done? What did he fear so intensely that even decades later it required this careful, obsessive concealment? I realized then that I was no longer a passive observer. I had been pulled into a web, one strand at a time, until I was tangled, unable to step away. The tension between us grew almost imperceptibly. He seemed to test me at every turn, gauging my reactions, measuring my curiosity. The incident that finally forced me into a position of authority came suddenly, without warning. He had been sitting in his chair, sipping tea, when his hand trembled violently, and he lost his balance, toppling slightly from the seat. I rushed to steady him, my adrenaline spiking as I realized that his frail body could not afford a fall. "You must stay with me," he said quietly, almost pleading, as I helped him back into the chair. But in that moment, I felt the unspoken. He was gauging me, testing my vigilance, weighing whether I could be trusted with what lay hidden behind his carefully maintained exterior. My hands shook, not from fear but from the recognition that I had stepped into something far larger than caregiving, something that required both discretion and courage. That night, sleep came fitfully. Shadows crawled along the walls, stretching and twisting in ways that seemed alive. I thought about the photograph I had discovered, the letters I had glimpsed, the clipped conversation over the phone. Each clue suggested a story I was only beginning to understand. And yet, there was more, something still unspoken, waiting for me to find it. I returned to the study the following afternoon, curiosity and caution warring inside me. That's when I noticed a letter that had been partially opened, as if someone had begun reading it and then abandoned the effort. It was addressed to someone I did not recognize, a name that meant nothing to me, yet carried the weight of intimate familiarity. The envelope was brittle, the paper yellowed with age. My fingers hovered over it for a moment, hesitant, aware that opening it would be trespassing, but the compulsion to know, to understand, was stronger. Inside were a few lines of carefully written script, tentative, almost trembling. The words hinted at a betrayal, a scandal that had been carefully hidden, and a secret with the potential to shake the very foundation of a family. I felt my chest tighten as I read, an icy thrill running through me. Every detail suggested consequences, repercussions, and truths that could destroy more than just reputations, they could unravel lives. I realized, with a growing sense of dread and fascination, that Mr. Aldridge's obsession with control, his avoidance of topics, his nightly rituals, they were all mechanisms to preserve something fragile and dangerous. And somehow, I had become part of that delicate balance. My presence, my silence, my attentiveness, they were now woven into the very fabric of his guarded world. As I set the letter aside, I felt the familiar surge of responsibility that comes with being a caretaker, but this time, it carried an unfamiliar edge of suspense, of danger. I was no longer merely tending to his physical needs. I was tending to a secret, a living, breathing enigma that had waited decades for someone like me to arrive. That night, as I lay awake in the guest room, the house alive with creaks and sighs, I understood something profound. Secrets are not just hidden, they live, they watch, and they test those who draw too close. And Mr. Aldridge's secret, whatever it was, had begun to test me. The truth isn't always what you expect, sometimes it's worse. By now, I had become attuned to the rhythm of the house. The way the floorboards groaned at odd intervals. The subtle hum of the heating vent in the study. The faint, almost imperceptible creak of the attic door that no one claimed to use. Each sound had a meaning, each movement a story, and I had learned to read them like an open book. Yet even with all my years of experience, nothing could have prepared me for the depth of what I was about to uncover. It began with a small, almost casual observation. A ledger, tucked behind a row of dusty books, slipped partially out as I adjusted a shelf. The cover was worn, the edges fraying, but inside were entries meticulously written in faded ink, dates, names, amounts, and cryptic notes in the margins. At first, it seemed like a collection of mundane transactions, financial records from decades past. But then patterns emerged, names repeated, connections forming, events hinted at that were never explained. I followed the trail with the quiet patience I had developed over a lifetime. Every letter I had glimpsed, every photograph I had touched, every micro-expression I had noticed, the fragments began to coalesce into a chilling narrative. Betrayal, deceit, a crime covered up so thoroughly that the world outside this house had never glimpsed it. And yet, the moral ambiguity of it all was staggering. I found myself torn between horror at what had been done and empathy for the man who had carried this burden alone for decades. Nightfall amplified everything. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting in ways that seemed alive. The wind brushed against the windows, producing soft, eerie whines. I heard the familiar creak of the attic floorboards, the whisper of my own footsteps, and faint murmurs that I could not place. At times, I thought I glimpsed movement in the corner of my eye, a figure darting behind a curtain, a shadow flitting across the hallway, but every time I turned, nothing was there. And then there were the moments when I felt as though I could see into Mr. Aldridge's mind, sensing the weight he carried like a living presence pressing against the air. His guilt was palpable, a residue that clung to him in waves. Loneliness had etched deep lines into his face, but it was the quiet, unspoken regrets that struck me most. The choices he had made, the people he had hurt, the lives altered because of one decision made in a moment of desperation. I confronted him about it one evening, not directly, not accusatorily, but gently, carefully, the way one might prod a sleeping animal, cautious yet deliberate. "You're hiding something," I said softly, meeting his pale eyes. "Something you've carried for a long time. I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. You don't have to speak. It's all right if you can't yet. But I see it." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes glistened with moisture, and I could see the weight of decades pressing down upon him. I thought I could carry it alone," he whispered. "I thought silence would be enough to protect everyone. But it never is it?" He began to recount the story in fragmented pieces, each confession a delicate balance between relief and terror. A betrayal among friends long dead. A misjudged decision that had led to someone's ruin. A secret that had rippled outward, touching lives in ways no one could have foreseen. The narrative twisted and turned, morally ambiguous and hauntingly human. I felt my own pulse quicken as I absorbed the truth, an intimate, devastating portrait of choices and consequences, a life lived in shadow. I did not flinch. I could not. My role demanded empathy, attentiveness, and a readiness to witness the darkest corners of another's soul. Yet even as I listened, I felt the weight of what he was sharing, not just as a caregiver, but as someone complicit in the silent act of witnessing. The truth he revealed could destroy reputations, unravel relationships, and haunt anyone who came near it. And yet, there was something fragile in his admission, a vulnerability that made him almost unrecognizable to the stern, controlled man I had met. Here was a human being stripped bare by his own conscience, a man seeking absolution in the presence of someone who could silently understand. That night, I moved through the house with heightened awareness. Every creak of the floorboard, every whisper of the wind, felt loaded with meaning. I knew he had chosen me not by accident, but by necessity. He needed a witness. Someone who could hold the truth without succumbing to fear, someone who could navigate the moral labyrinth and remain intact. It was during these long hours that I stumbled upon the ledger once more. As I traced the faded ink with my fingers, a new detail emerged, something that had eluded me before. A single entry, dated decades ago, noted a name I recognized from one of the partially opened letters. The amount, the location, the notation, it suggested a connection not only to his past transgressions but to someone still alive, someone who might not want these truths uncovered. My heart raced. The revelation came with a sharp, insistent warning: the danger of knowing, the fragility of secrecy, and the price of exposure. I realized that my role as a caretaker had evolved into something far riskier. I was no longer merely observing, I was entwined in a web of deception, one misstep away from consequences I could not fully foresee. I found myself standing in the study, the ledger in my hands, the dim lamplight casting long shadows across the walls. Mr. Aldridge had retreated to his chair, silent but attentive, watching me in a way that suggested he knew exactly what I had discovered. For a moment, the air between us was taut with unspoken understanding. I was both confidant and participant, drawn into the labyrinth of a life carefully curated to hide a devastating truth. As the night deepened, the house seemed to pulse around us. Shadows lengthened, whispers grew faintly urgent, and I sensed the fragile boundary between revelation and danger tightening. My mind raced with questions. How far would he trust me? Could I bear the burden of his secret? And what other truths were still waiting to surface, lurking just beyond the periphery of my understanding? And then, as I began to process the confession, my eyes fell on another envelope, partially hidden behind a stack of books, a letter addressed to someone I didn't recognize. Unlike the others, this one was sealed with wax, its surface marred with a deep crimson stamp. Something about it felt alive, urgent, almost dangerous. I could sense that opening it would cross a threshold I might not be able to return from. Yet, I couldn't resist. Not entirely. The letter carried a weight, a promise of more truth, perhaps more peril. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, a mixture of anticipation and dread. The secrets of this house were far from fully revealed, and I had stepped willingly into the shadows. I realized then that being a caretaker isn't just about healing the body, it's about holding the weight of someone else's soul. That night, the house felt heavier, almost alive with memory. I stayed beside Mr. Aldridge, the dim bedside lamp casting long shadows across the room, listening to the slow, uneven rhythm of his breathing. Every inhale, every sigh, carried decades of secrets, regret, and isolation. In that silence, I understood that my role had grown far beyond tending to his physical needs. I was now a witness to a lifetime of hidden truths. The confessions, the letters, the ledger, and the photograph I had discovered, all had revealed a morally complex, terrifyingly human life. The revelations carried consequences that rippled far beyond this room, far beyond Mr. Aldridge himself. Sitting there, I felt the weight of knowledge pressing against me, a responsibility I could not escape. True care, I realized, is never only physical. It demands presence, empathy, and the courage to carry someone else's burdens. I watched him closely, noting small gestures that revealed more than words could ever convey. The tremor in his hand as he reached for water, the subtle furrow of his brow when recalling past losses, the slight twitch of his lips at a remembered kindness, all these small movements spoke of vulnerability, remorse, and a profound loneliness. These were the fragments of a man who had lived with secrecy and guilt for decades, shaping his every action, his every thought. Later, he handed me the sealed letter I had glimpsed days before. "It's time you knew everything," he whispered. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the wax seal, revealing words that outlined choices with far-reaching consequences, connections to people I didn't recognize, and events that were morally ambiguous, haunting, and irreversible. I felt the enormity of the responsibility placed upon me. Knowledge, I realized, could protect or destroy, depending on how it was handled. In that moment, I became more than a caretaker. I was a custodian of truth, entrusted with secrets that could shatter lives if revealed. The weight of that trust pressed against me, a constant reminder that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, yet too heavy to ignore. Being a witness required silence, discretion, and an unwavering presence, all of which tested my empathy in ways I had never experienced. The house seemed to respond to our shared understanding. Shadows flickered along the walls, and the familiar creaks of the floorboards carried a new, almost sentient significance. Every sound, every movement, seemed imbued with the gravity of the truths we now shared. I moved carefully, aware that each step could disturb the delicate balance between revelation and discretion. Throughout the night, I observed him, noting the quiet, intimate details of his life. His fingers lingered over photographs, tracing the edges with a care that spoke of longing and regret. A small smile occasionally flickered across his lips at memories I could not access, a fleeting glimpse of joy amid years of burden. These moments were fragile yet powerful, reminding me that even those who carry the heaviest guilt still contain traces of tenderness, love, and humanity. I reflected on empathy, how it shields, connects, and burdens. My ability to sense his emotions had guided me through countless caregiving situations, but now it anchored me in a web of moral complexity. I carried not only the responsibility of tending to his physical health but the emotional weight of knowing what he had done, understanding its consequences, and respecting the fragile equilibrium that kept his world intact. As dawn approached, the quiet rhythm of the house brought a strange calm. Mr. Aldridge stirred slightly, and in that moment, I recognized a subtle trust in his gaze, a recognition that I had seen him, understood him, and held his truths with care. I realized that care is not merely about action, it is about presence, understanding, and the quiet acceptance of the complexities of human nature. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a brief reflection. Secret shape lives in unseen ways, influencing choices, relationships, and even the fabric of daily existence. Witnessing another person's hidden life requires courage and discretion. Some truths, I understood, are never meant to be spoken, yet they demand acknowledgement, empathy, and respect. In the early light, I made a silent promise to myself, to honor the trust placed in me, to bear the weight of what I had learned, and to continue to serve as a silent witness to lives that might never be understood fully by the outside world. Care, I realized, is never only physical, it is moral, emotional, and deeply human. It is the act of witnessing, of holding space for vulnerability, and carrying the burden of truth with quiet strength. That morning, the house felt lighter, not because the secrets had vanished, but because they were held, safely, in a space of understanding. I accepted my role as the silent witness, knowing that some stories are never fully resolved, that some truths linger, and that the act of listening and holding is itself a form of healing, for both the one who carries the secret and the one entrusted with it. If you want to hear more stories I was never supposed to tell, subscribe to The Silent Caretaker, and remember, some truths are never truly gone.